Today on Hey Look, the National Park Service still has a website, I'd like to bring your attention to the National Park of American Samoa. That's right, before Samoa was a Girl Scout cookie, it was the name given to a group of Pacific islands about 2,500 miles or 4,000 kilometers southwest of Hawaii and about 3,000 miles or 4,700 kilometers east of Australia, lying between Fiji and Tahiti. It's out there. Claimed as a U.S. territory in the 19th century for the purpose of building a naval outpost, what is now called American Samoa had a similar history of invasion by busybody missionaries, curious scientific explorers, and sailors in search of shore leave that included fresh water and food, and hopefully a bath. So far away from America, Samoa and later American Samoa were not subject to the same plundering of natural products that affected Hawaii so severely. 90% of the original rainforests remain. But as a colony, American Samoa does suffer from the poverty of the strange dislocation colonization causes. All the same, if you are looking for a chance to really see a tropical place, weird birds and flowers and bugs and everything, take a trip with plenty of time to American Samoa and the National Park of American Samoa. And whatever you do, bring no plants with you. But do be on the lookout for some old school Polynesian chickens. Episode 142. Are chickens alternate reality pigs? Hello and welcome to the history of American food. This week I'll be looking at the role of chickens and eggs in early 19th century America, how they functioned in the home and farm economy, how the growth of cities was changing their popularity, and how domestic chickens were kinda small-scale piggies. To find out how, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that if you didn't have space for a pig to work as your home composter, chickens can take over the job. These omnivorous avians have been living among humans and taking in the trash for thousands of years. So just how did humans and chickens get together? Much in the same way pigs and horses and cows and geese and sheep and goats and dogs started to exist together. The jungle fowl of Southeast Asia had something to offer to the humans, and humans found it worthwhile enough to protect and even augment their breeding efforts and expand their natural range. And for whatever reason, this sort of bird was able to be cool with living around the people thing. Most types of animals never get there. You'll notice in my list of commonly domesticated animals, they offer a range of products and services. Food in many instances, but they also provide things like transport, clothing, writing tools, alarm systems, religious support, and garbage disposal. But in all those options, none of the animals we've domesticated have their first job as entertainment. But that seems to be our relationship with chickens. Apparently the first captive and then domesticated jungle fowl were taken in and acclimatized to humanity for the purpose of cockfighting. That's right, chicken domestication seems to be tied to entertainment and gambling, which isn't as crazy as it sounds. Some of the oldest human-built monumental constructions seem to be associated with the group experiences caused by taking hallucinatory mushrooms. These are in ancient Anatolia, that is, Upper Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization and all that. Look up Göbekli Tepe if you are curious. There's a link in the show notes. For what it's worth, there are bird carvings all over these things, but the scorpion relief in photo 11 is simply stunning. Anyway, you can go see with your own eyes. Even 11,000 years ago, bringing people together for intense novel experiences was a powerful urge. But back to the proto-chicken. The domestication of jungle fowl, the red jungle fowl especially, seems to hinge more on how fun it was to breed them to fight, rather than any particular prowess in meat production. See, at the time, or likely the multiple times the jungle fowl were domesticated, because it seems likely this happened more than once, in the same way the domestication of other animals seems to have occurred multiple times in multiple places. Anyway, about 8,000 years ago, when domestication events were happening, There were many sources of bird meat in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and frankly, many of them were larger and more worthwhile the trouble to capture, kill, pluck, clean, and cook. And as for eggs, the average jungle fowl in normal jungle fowl conditions were producing no more than 6-ish, 8-ish eggs a year. I mean, many waterfowl are more prolific than that, except in one instance. These red jungle fowl are among the animals adapted to follow a bonanza of food with a burst of fertility. It was observed in the years when bamboo trees had large coordinated seed releases, the jungle fowl eating them would have a burst in egg laying and resulting chicks. As an example, the local black rats do the same thing. But the locals looking after their domesticated fighting cocks and the hens they kept for breeding purposes noticed that they could be encouraged into laying more if they were fed more. Anyway, these birds were fun to fight and breed, and it's hard to miss that they produce some fine, flashy feathers, which makes sense since they are from the same family as other birds known for their notable plumage, like pheasants and peacocks. And unlike many species of animals, they could adapt to life amongst the humans. In fact, over time, they found ways to thrive. Along with the ability to produce more eggs in times of plenty, they could get by on fairly little in the lean seasons. Further, as omnivores, they were able to live off the scraps of human food. If there's one thing that's been eternally true, anywhere humans occupy for a length of time, we start to build up trash piles. In our modern days, with so much stuff and much of it made of things that don't degrade quickly, this is obvious. But even when the refuse was mostly hardy plant matter, bones, shells, and human waste, the piles still do grow. Archaeology, of course, lives for these piles as they tell the story of who was eating and gathering and making what, when, and where. And these piles can turn up in wild places. I have run into a shoreline of a bay in British Columbia that turned out to be overgrown shell middens. Anyway, while it was well known that pig keepers could feed the pigs on scraps and waste, it turns out that the jungle fowl turned domesticated chickens were good for the same thing. The vegetable scraps from preparing supper, the grain that had gone soft or sprouted, all chicken feed, the husks and peels of your fruits, the last bite of meat on a bone, all could go to keeping the chickens well fed and producing extra eggs. It also meant you could bring chickens along on a trip, as long as secrecy wasn't a priority. Quiet chickens has never really been a thing. They can survive quite well on just a little food and eat the scraps you give them, and then they will get back into gear when food is plentiful again. Excellent. So chickens began to travel. They rapidly went east and became part of the standard cargo on the canoes as Polynesians spread out over the Pacific Ocean, populating the volcanic protuberances. There's even reasonable chicken bone evidence that chickens were actually dropped off along the west coast of South America in the same time period, around 1000 CE, when Polynesians were there picking up sweet potatoes from the coastal natives. Yes, those fashionable purple ube sweet potatoes that are all over social media started in South America and were Polynesian cargo before getting to Korea and Japan and whatnot. But that's another episode. Anyway, what is less clear is whether chickens remained and spread, and it doesn't seem likely. Because why mess about with a 2 to 3 pound bird when you have turkeys and curassows for meat and quetzals for feathers? Okay, who am I kidding? Even the ocellated turkey that lives in the western side of Mexico and Guatemala, with its copper and black patches interspersed with iridescent green-blue feathers, outshines all but the flashiest fancy chickens. But regardless, chickens traveled well, and it seems likely they made it to South America before the Spaniards in the 16th century. And along with that, chickens also went west, to India, to Greater Mesopotamia, Persia, and even to Egypt. Excellent record keepers, the Egyptians. In fact, it is incredibly likely that by 1400 BCE, chickens had been there, probably initially as war booty. Over time, they would spread all around the Mediterranean basin as trade and war proceeded apace. Oh, and if you're kind of familiar with Egyptian hieroglyphs and you say, but what about that chick hieroglyph? Doesn't that mean chickens were there for longer? That has been identified as a baby quail. Oh, another interesting note, while chickens were definitely around Egypt by 1400 BCE, no mummified chickens appear in burials until after the Persian conquests in about the 500s BCE. You'd find other mummified birds, geese, falcons, quail, but it was only after Cambyses rolled over the Egyptian empire in the 6th century that chicken and rooster mummies and paintings started showing up in tombs. For what it's worth, the Persians had been big chicken farmers for a long time and may have introduced chickens to the Greeks in a major way with that whole series of attempted invasions around 490 BCE. We always hear about the Battle of Marathon and the race, but very little about the introduction of the Persian chicken. From there, the chicken seems to have traveled as road food, trade good, and refugee resettlement equipment all throughout Europe. There's plenty of evidence that the Celts and other Britons had their own chickens when the Romans arrived in an attempt to lock down the lead trade and introduce wine and civilization. Sure, the Romans might have brought their Dorking chickens with that extra toe, but the locals already had their own breeds that they mainly seem to have used for, cockfighting, as there were plenty of other birds that yielded much more meat for the trouble. Anyway, Roman Empire, Dark Ages that actually weren't, shout out to the awesome book, The Bright Ages, the Renaissance, the Plague Years, and the Age of Exploration, and there in the 17th and 18th century, European chickens are on boats coming to North America. And at this point, as I've said, these are semi-feral, scrawny, speedy birds kept more for their eggs than they were for their meat. And so they were set up for their role in the early 19th century. There are lots of birds out there to eat in America at this point, and people are capturing them with nets, taking them down with spears, and even shooting them for sport. So, eating chickens, except for the excess roosters in spring, the proverbial spring chicken was not really a major part of the American diet. As with the rest of the birds out there for the plucking, chickens were kept for their eggs, and they were just left to kind of run around, and in the grand scheme of things, not thought of as particularly valuable. They would largely scratch for their own food, keep down the bugs, and were handy for disposing of all of the food scraps in prepping dinner, especially if you didn't have pigs or you didn't want to have your kitchen maid slogging all the way down to the pig pens to dispose of the kitchen trash. The chickens in the yard ate a lot of kitchen scraps and forked over eggs in the spring through the fall in return. And it's the chicken's very perceived valuelessness, especially by those who were keeping score, that led to two types of innovation along with the continuation of some older traditions. First, the older tradition, cockfighting, along with the universality of brewing booze, setting up new societies in America, also bred gambling. Rowing races along the coast and on rivers, and horse races as soon as any horses were around. I mean, look at any old East Coast town or city in America and tell me it doesn't have a race street, because that's what it was used for. And of course, there was cockfighting. While cockfighting has now been outlawed in all 50 states, it might be a little shocking to learn that the last state did so in 2008. Less shocking is learning that that state was Louisiana. And the most unshocking follow-up is that cockfighting continues underground in several places around the U.S. The most prolific practitioners are to be found in Tennessee and Kentucky, where it's been going on basically since colonizers built up their 18th century farms near each other. In fact, it was once thought that Mitch McConnell might be jeopardizing his political career when he supported the tightening of enforcement and raising of fines for the practice. The second innovation was handing over the improvement and rearing of chickens to the least valued members of society, enslaved Africans and women. Slave codes adopted all over early America had specific provisions preventing the ownership or possession of livestock by enslaved people. Horses, cows, sheep, pigs, and even geese were listed specifically, but chickens were deemed too worthless to worry about in detail. In fact, it was common for the inventory of households, often taken as part of someone's will or debt collection, to list things that might seem odd to us, like bedsheets, forks, partial candles, and panes of glass. Livestock would be listed except for chickens, which, when listed, were part of miscellany. It was rare for the chickens to be counted. All the same, plenty of enslaved people were able to make enough money to buy their own freedom and that of their family members using chickens. Many West Africans, along with having cow-keeping skills, see episode 16, they also had practice herding flocks of birds. Chickens seem not to have been particularly common south of the Sahara Desert in the farming villages that carpeted coastal Africa, but that was mainly because flocks of native birds lived in the same niche, most notably the guinea fowl. In modern times, this domesticated African bird can now be found in restaurants, serving up other fancy fowl like canvas-back duck and Highland pheasant. Anyway, these practical farm skills combined with cooking prowess would be at the bottom of many stories once emancipation was enacted and the Great Migration began. The biggest one, of course, will be the spread of fried chicken. In my catalog of the most American food right now, which is the spicy fried chicken sandwich with pickles, fried chicken lies at its heart. And fried chicken, as a common yet prized American dish, comes from right here, the early 19th century. Its emergence as an American dish rose out of the meeting of three important elements. 1. Access to a group of people with practice frying savory foods, meat especially, in oil. This was pulled off through captured enslavement of West Africans who were already past masters at identifying, harvesting, and using oils to fry foods. Notably, in the early 1800s, people were still being shipped directly from African Atlantic ports to both the Caribbean and American shores. Enslaved women preparing food in American kitchens had either prepared fried bird or fish in Africa themselves, or been raised by a mother who had. 2. Adequate fat for skillet frying or deep fat frying. The rise of the lard hog made this possible. The hog farms and slaughtering facilities that could turn out barrels of lard were starting to appear with these pig drives I spoke of just a couple of episodes ago. So you could have a deep skillet or cauldron of boiling lard, to quote Mary Randolph, in your kitchen. So the fat was available to start frying savory foods. We had advanced from the rare, sweet Dutch donuts and fritters of the previous century that had largely been fried in clarified butter. And 3. Plenty of wheat flour. Until the wheat fields of the expanding West and their paired wind and water-powered flour mills, America had been a breadcrumb-saving country, just like Europe. But with the spread of wheat flour due to mills and canals, there was now enough flour to dredge the birds. And with our rising global trade, we had adequate black pepper to spice this special dish, and that didn't hurt either. The progress of fried chicken, as rising out of the American Southeast from kitchens run by African-born women and their children, is reflected in its arrival in the cookbooks of the wealthy. There is no savory fried food at all in Amelia Simmons' first cookbook, and the contemporary popular English authored books of the same time period might have a recipe for small fish like smelts being dredged in flour, run through an egg wash and crumbs, and then fried to imitate the fried fish in the Jewish style, unquote. But for fried chicken, you had to look to American recipes influenced by African cooks. The first easily available published recipe for fried chicken is in Mary Randolph's The Virginia Housewife. While published in 1820, documented recipes that had been used around the end of the previous century. She was the wife of a rich tobacco planter who definitely had a kitchen with enslaved cooks. Her cookbook came about when the tobacco bubble burst and her family fortune collapsed. She was able to turn her years of running a fancy house into running a well-regarded boarding house with above-average food. The main scholarly work done on Mary Randolph by Karen Hess for her book published in 1984 does not examine how much help Mary Randolph had in her kitchen, though based on the general complexity of many of the recipes and the location of her boarding house around Richmond, Virginia, makes it incredibly unlikely that the Randolph boarding house did not have enslaved help and therefore their cooking prowess in the kitchen. So how did a late 18th century and early 19th century cook fry her chicken? In Randolph's recipe, it calls for the cook to cut up chickens as for fricassee. To us, that means to cut it into leg quarters where the leg and the thigh are attached, take off the wings, and separate the breast from the back. These chickens would often be 2 pounds or possibly less after being plucked and drawn. The pieces were to be dredged well with flour and sprinkled with salt, and then placed in a good quantity of boiling lard to fry them light brown. The recipe also suggests frying up small balls of cornmeal mush to serve alongside and possibly adding a thin gravy. The fried cornmeal mush balls would have been thought of as sort of a fried dumpling, kind of the precursor to a hush puppy. The lack of instruction on seasoning could be taken 2 ways. Either this chicken was very chickeny and very little flavoring was added to it or the fried cornmeal mush tidbits, or adding seasoning was simply assumed. In the short, low instruction recipes of the day, it was assumed nobody needed to be told to season your food. Again, at this stage, you learned cooking in person. Recipes were just reminder notes from one skilled cook to another. Now, an almost identical recipe is found in the 1880 published book, What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking, which had been dictated by one Abby Fisher, who had been cooking in Mobile, Alabama for the 35 years previous to her departure from the area after emancipation. Abby Fisher was Black. She had then emigrated to San Francisco, where this book was published. It's worth noting that Abby Fisher includes instructions to cut the chicken at all the joints, to wash each piece, and include salt and black pepper in the recipe. And she also includes a gravy recipe for serving. And serving these birds with some kind of gravy honestly makes sense, because for the most part, the birds they were using absolutely were the early 19th century chicken in its general scrawny running around form. So it was doomed to be stringy and a bit dry no matter how lovingly cooked. Remember, at this point, brining your chicken was not a thing. And so these chickens in their live state largely remained nearly valueless, and thus the realm of enslaved folk and women, except in a few specific cases. And here are some examples. The first is, do you need a reason to charge an enslaved or recently emancipated person with a serious crime in order to exert control over them with the help and blessing of local law enforcement? Well, creating cases of chicken stealing was a favorite method. And this is ironic since most chickens at this time were being raised and cared for by enslaved or recently emancipated people. Suddenly, those chickens had value. The second way. Are you bored of gardening? Is horse breeding and racing eating up all the family fortune? Well, the early 19th century created the follow-up to the 17th century Dutch tulip bulb madness in the form of fancy chicken fever. The way this got started lies in the trading relationships with China and India that were firming up. More than just silk, tea, and the raw materials for gunpowder were in those ships. The chickens of China and India started arriving in England and caught the fancy of Queen Victoria. The most famous of these world-traveling poultry were some large feather-legged chickens known as Shanghais or Cochin Chinas. Because they were poorly labeled upon arrival, their origin is fuzzy and much argued over. Because in the early 19th century, China was specific enough. I mean, mentioning Shanghai was almost a pedantic, boring level of detail. Anyway, Queen Victoria was very much taken by these birds and set a fashion for fancy chicken breeding and showing. Meanwhile, in America, a few decades earlier, several rich men styling themselves as men of science, including Thomas Jefferson, had also begun importing chickens from around Europe and seeking fowl imported from places called exotic, like China and India and some other places vaguely understood as the Far East. The stock of American fancy chickens, mixed with the chicken breeding frenzy imported from England, led to a single chicken egg, purportedly holding an exciting chick, to sell in 1849 Boston for $1 entire. By 1850, the bubble was bursting and people were stuck with these pricey fowl, since many of the people who had jumped on the fancy chicken bandwagon were in fact city people lacking general chicken yards, and most of them had never killed, plucked, or cleaned a chicken. They found themselves paying farmers from the countryside to come get these formerly valuable poultry. But a silver lining to this whole fiasco was to emerge in the second half of the century, adding new specimens of chicken to the American population that had been in a genetic bottleneck since they'd all come from a few animals brought over earlier. It would create all sorts of new opportunities to explore diversity and create new hybrids. But that story will have to wait for a future season. But during that moment of chicken frenzy, there were some valuable fancy chickens, and they were accounted separately from the scrawny, disregarded yardbirds that made up the majority of the chicken population of America up to this point. Crazy chicken bubbles aside, how did chicken economics stack up for the smallholder or person holding down a small farm raising a variety of produce outside of but near town who was growing food for themselves plus goods to sell? Were chickens a worthy economic competitor to the pig? Well, chickens and pigs both have that knack of turning what is effectively trash into food. With the pigs, it's meat, and with the chickens, some meat. But again, in this age, it was mostly for the eggs. Both animals have things to offer other than the obvious edibles. With pigs, it's things like bristles for brushes, and their hide made tough leather for items that needed to withstand a lot of wear. Chicken feathers stuffed many a bed, and chicken manure, then as now, was favored for gardens, and their bug-munching skills helped with pest control. But the slaughter of one pig provides far more meat, and the meat preserved well through salting, smoking, and drying. Chicken meat was not generally preserved, but hauling around fresh, that is still living chickens, is far easier than carting around pigs. And if the chickens get loose in your garden, well, the garden will be okay. After a pig spends a few hours there, a good chunk of your potential winter stores would likely be gone. And the fat available from pigs? Far, far greater. Yes, chicken fat is valuable, but it obviously doesn't come in large quantities and is largely eaten up with the bird it came with or soon after. So pound for pound, pigs will provide you with more money, but they take up more space and are more trouble. So if you're running a smaller farm, chickens are probably a better bet. Another thing chickens and pigs have in common, in the early 19th century, they were seasonal providers. Typically, hogs are slaughtered in the winter and a few excess piglets throughout the year for special meals. But most of the pork one eats is preserved in one way or another. So pork at this time, especially fresh pork, was a seasonal meat. The major exception to this would be barbecue parties, but those were large celebrations and self-limiting in their own way. The seasons of chickens were a little different. Given lots of food and enough daylight, they would start laying more or less an egg a day, which incidentally is why egg dishes with lots of spring herbs are traditional spring celebration food in lots of cultures in the Northern Hemisphere. And as long as the eggs were removed, these chickens would continue to lay more. Incidentally, most birds will do this at least a few times. It's sort of a backup plan adaptation. You'll notice that lots of birds only lay 1 or 2 or maybe 3 eggs, and these are usually birds that have to bring food to their babies. Any more than just a few babies, and none of the babies will make it. But birds like chickens and ducks, they live on the ground, and so the babies feed themselves from the start. So they can have larger clutches of eggs and continue to lay more replacement eggs for longer. But back where we are. In the age before artificial light, no matter how well fed your hens, once the daylight shortens, the eggs stop coming. So eggs are seasonal. There are ways to preserve eggs so you can have them for things like Christmas cakes and eggnog. Or it also allows them to be shipped long distances. But the most important thing these eggs had going for them is that they had their natural cuticle, which was left intact in the 19th century. And this meant that even unrefrigerated eggs wouldn't go bad for at least 3 weeks, which is how long it takes for a baby chick to develop. So that actually kind of makes a lot of sense. By the by, because American chickens are not vaccinated against salmonella, and American egg producers wash off the protective cuticle to reduce salmonella contamination, and there are many more pathogens running around now than there were in the 19th century, and most chickens live in extremely crowded conditions, letting your eggs sit on the counter for up to 3 weeks is not a recommended egg storage manner here in modern America. But in the early 19th century, our pre-refrigerator people could keep those eggs around. And if you did a couple of the different things to stop the airflow through the pores in the eggshell, those eggs could last even longer. And that's what made Christmas cakes with eggs possible, even though the chickens stopped laying in the early fall. Now, like eggs, chicken meat was also largely seasonal. At the beginning of the laying season, a few hens in the flock would get the job of actually hatching eggs. There is usually a broody hen, one that gets very upset when you take away the eggs and is good at looking after the eggs under her care, that is, turning them regularly. And she'll have a good hatching rate. And so she would usually be the one to actually hatch the eggs that would turn into chickens. It is important to note that at this time, all chicken hatching was happening under chickens. And that meant that the number of chickens you could hatch in any given year was limited. The technological upgrade that will make expanding chicken flocks more possible will come around in the second half of the century, and that's the incubator. But it won't truly explode until electricity is widely available in the 20th century. So hold on to your hats for that. But these early 19th century hen-hatched baby chicks ate all the spring bugs and greens they could and grew up to be layers themselves. But the roosters, those cocks, the male chickens, those are obviously not good for egg production. So through the spring, as they grew up, they would be culled and end up in the pot. And the younger the chicken, the more tender he was. Now, as the egg layers got old and their production fell off, they too would end up as dinner. Thus, stewing hens. They needed long cooking since they were old and tough and would often end up as dinner at the end of the laying season into the fall and winter. And for special occasions, yes, a chicken could be fried. But as you now know, that was a lot of work, from live chicken to fried drumstick. So it was also a rare dish. So in the end, chickens, they'll never replace pigs. Pigs were for meat, chickens were for eggs, but both of these could be stored and preserved and transported and sold for cash, and both produced non-food products that helped make life better. So, in the end, they fill a similar niche for producing something out of almost nothing on a farm. Okay, but before this episode ends, there is a story about early 19th century San Francisco that I have been sitting on until we got here, about just how seriously Americans took eggs and the lengths we would go to get them, even back in the day. I now introduce you to the story of the San Francisco Egg War. Now, somewhere in your brain, I'm sure you are aware that gold was discovered near San Francisco in 1848, and thus the miners' 49ers. There had been other gold strikes on the East Coast. In fact, part of the Cherokee removal that led to the Trail of Tears, that forced moving out of about 60,000 people of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw tribes to Oklahoma, had partly to do with the claiming of farmland, yes, but there was also the Carolina Gold Rush that began in 1799, followed by another large strike found in 1827. So, we've been finding gold in the U.S. for a while. But anyway, the one in San Francisco was massive. And while the Spanish had a bit of presence in the area, and it was already a global stopover for whaling ships and traders from China, the influx of delusionally hopeful Americans flattened most of that history in favor of their own myth-making. True to the style of colonization we started the country with, these prospectors and despoilers of all sorts set out woefully unprepared and just expecting food to be there. And it was just not in forms they recognized or were going to do the work to find, harvest, and prepare. So as you might imagine, there was quite a bit of death from starvation and the associated diseases that take hold when you are severely undernourished. But as the town was established and cows and pigs started to arrive on ships or in drives from Texas and such, the barrels of salt pork and salt fish rolled in, and professional hunters and fishers got to work providing the town with meat, and things settled down to a less desperate state. Because there were so few women, it also meant that there wasn't much in the way of a chicken population. And no chickens, no eggs. Except in this case, there were eggs, because there was a barren, rocky island chain, the Farallon Islands, about 25 miles outside of San Francisco Bay. And each spring through July, clouds of common murres would come and lay eggs on these islands. The common murre is a black and white seabird that looks like a cross between a seagull and a penguin. It doesn't fly very well through the air, but it does zip around underwater chasing fish quite impressively. And like a penguin, it lays one egg at a time, right there on the ground. Anyway, when these birds in the hundreds of thousands descended on the islands, they also laid the appropriate amount of eggs. And so, starting with some enterprising fishermen, some of the eggs were collected and brought back to the burgeoning city. And by burgeoning, I mean the population went from about 1,000 in 1848 to 25,000 in 1849, 35,000 by the mid-1850s, and 56,000 by 1860. Now, some interesting facts were learned about these murre eggs. First of all, if you just go picking up eggs willy-nilly, you are certain to get eggs with partially grown chicks in them, not appealing to the American eater. So it was common to go smash a bunch of eggs and then return a few days later to collect the fresh replacement eggs. And then when these eggs were brought back to the excited diners in San Francisco, they would break into these eggs to see that the yolk was a lurid red, and they tasted distinctly of fish, the bird's diet. But apparently this was no deterrent. These fishermen and then the subsequent eggers, as the egg harvesters were called, could charge up to, yes, $1 per egg. And hotels would charge $5 for dishes like eggs Florentine, which is more or less a spinach omelet with a cream sauce. This comes out to a $30 egg in today's money and over $100 for a simple egg dish. Anyway, over the next 30 years, there would be claims made on the Farallon Islands and plenty of lives lost. The trip out to the islands could be treacherous, with boats simply lost due to weather and equipment failures. The steep, rocky islands also claimed their share of lives as the birds were chased off the flat plateaus onto cliff ledges in hopes of successfully raising a chick. In response, the eggers would climb to ever more precarious places to claim eggs and occasionally miss their grip. And then to top it off, an out-and-out egg war occurred in the 1860s with ambushes and a few pitched battles. Largely fought with cudgels and hatchets rather than firearms, these were wounding and bloody affairs. Egging on these islands would continue into the 1880s when two things happened to bring it to a close. First, the quite predictable reduction of the murre population. No matter how many birds you started with, reckless destruction and predation over decades would collapse the population. And second, with the railroad and the invention of the electric egg incubator, the city of Petaluma, California would rise as the egg capital of California, and for a while, the world, fulfilling the egg hunger of millions by hatching as many laying hens as they possibly could for distribution around the state and later the entire nation. And murres have gone back to being cute little seabirds that are able to nest more or less undisturbed on the Farallons. Their eggs are still eaten by some of the local native populations and First Nations people of Canada, who have always included a few murre eggs in their annual menu. The presence of California and its gold fields are going to exert many more strange distortions on the American menu as it stands right now. Eggs were just the first one. Now next week, it's time to bring a new food into the fold. Oats. That's right. It's a new day for this grain on the American menu. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episode helps me know you're out there, but even better are your spreading of the show by word of mouth. Letting people know that you're listening and enjoying the show is how the show grows. I'd also like to specifically thank Randy's Chicken blog and call it out as a fun and useful resource for the chicken curious out there. You want more food and history in your future? Well, with federal funding being cut for libraries and museums, now is the time to step up and be a friend to your local library. These are incredible resources that make our lives better in both direct and indirect ways. Help them keep up their valuable work. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere on the internets as @THOA Food. And all of this information is available in the show description.